Thank you all for joining us for our final session of the Fall 2020 Virtual Supply Chain Forum. I'm really happy to be here with Dr. Randy Bradley and our GSCI Research Fellow, Alan Amling, to present on blockchain. This is probably my favorite title of any session from the entire forum, blockchain, ROI or RIP. So really looking forward to getting into the content here today. This session will work similarly to the previous breakout sessions where you all can post your questions in the chat. We'll handle Q&A at the end of the session. And if you have any questions in the meantime, you can reach out to me directly via chat as well. So I will go ahead and turn this over to Randy and Alan.
Well, great. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. Randy and I will be batting cleanup for the 2020 Fall Supply Chain Forum and talking about a topic that has been celebrated and much maligned, blockchain. And, you know, I thought I would start out just by talking about why does blockchain matter? And that's really why we pursued this. This was actually a research study that was part of the Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative. I worked on this research with Dr. Mary Holcomb and Dr. Randy Bradley, who will be presenting with me today. And the topic was really born out of both optimism and skepticism. And if I had to say whether there were more optics or people with an optimistic lookout or skeptics, I would say probably more skeptics. But people were interested and they were interested in, is the promise of blockchain, is it all hype, or what's the reality? And why does blockchain matter? And there's really two things driving it. When we talk about the promise of blockchain, there was a mathematician, Alfred Whitehead, that said civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. And you think about what all of us, and we've heard a lot of presentations about digitization and digitalization of the supply chain. And that's really what we're trying to get, which is this kind of friction-free transactions. And that really is what blockchain was built for, and has a lot of hype. The blockchain and supply chain management is expected to grow at an annual growth rate of 87%, and increase from 45 million in 2018 to 3.3 billion by 2023. But is that just hype? And that's what we really set out to research. So we broke it down into 3 steps, which is exploring where blockchain can add value to the supply chain, identifying top application areas, interviewing companies that are actually exploring and using blockchain today, and we'll bring you some of that research back. And then put forth a decision-making framework, giving you, based on what we learned, what we heard, what is some pragmatic advice that we can leave you with to help guide you on your own blockchain journey. And we'll start out the presentation, and I'll talk about some of the research that we did, both research of, what has been written. And then we interviewed supply chain leaders. We'll talk about both of those things. And then Randy will end up the presentation with some real practical, pragmatic advice. So I think it's fair to start out just to level set everyone around what is blockchain. And this actually this question has been the subject of quite a few Dilbert cartoons that you may have read. And it can be difficult to understand, especially if you get deep into the technology and the hashes and algorithms and all that, but for a business context, that's not really important. That's not really what we're talking about today. And so an easy way to think of the components of blockchain is to use the train tracks analogy. And I love this because it talks about why it's really important without getting into all the detail. And in the train track analogy, the railroad ties can be considered a block of information. The track that runs over the railroad ties is the chain that connects one block to another. And the trains are the applications that operate on top of the train track. And so if you think about that analogy, multiple people would need to agree on where to place each of those railroad ties. The railroad ties are put in place. The track runs over the railroad ties, and you could theoretically move a railroad tie. Just like in blockchain, you could change information in a blockchain, but just like a railroad tie, you wouldn't be able to remove that railroad tie without others knowing and agreeing to it. So that's why, any changes in a blockchain cannot go undetected. And that's why we say that a blockchain is immutable. This method of creating a permanent ledger that is distributed among multiple users is what's being put to test in the supply chain. And there's many different applications that we'll talk about today, from quality control, product origin, provenance, tracking and tracing, freight payment and reconciliation, and we'll touch on those. And I'll give you a great case study that kind of brings it all together. So let's talk about the hype cycle. Kind of where is it on the hype cycle right now? So in October of 2019, Gartner released their hype cycle for blockchain technologies. And so you can see that the core blockchain technology, distributed ledger, the cryptocurrency mining, Bitcoin, that has been around for quite a while, has already sunk from hype to the trough of disillusionment. And I would say that it's on its way back out. You may have read in the press just last month that PayPal is now allowing customers to buy and sell Bitcoin. So that's starting to become more mainstream. The big banks are starting to talk about it more. So that's at a different stage. But for supply chain, the technologies that we're talking about are smart contracts and interoperability between blockchains, and integrating blockchain with other technologies like IoT. That's still, on its way up the hype cycle and near the top. And especially smart contracts. Smart contracts are absolutely kind of a pivotal piece of blockchain for supply chain. And a simple way to think about a smart contract, it's essentially you take a physical contract and you digitize it so that the terms and conditions in the contract are executed automatically as information is input into the blockchain. And the way to think about a simple smart contract is, if someone puts $1 into a vending machine and they press the button for a Snickers bar, then dispense a Snickers bar. So you can think about this in terms of invoice reconciliation. If a transportation company delivers a shipment and it's in good condition and it's on time and it's complete, then disperse payment to the trucking company and the vendor. So right now it's kind of at the top of the hype cycle, and we're expecting that it's going to continue to mature. And it's important to put this into perspective. So that hype cycle was at the end of last year. We took a look at Gartner hype cycles from 10 years ago. So look at streaming and cloud computing 10 years ago. Those were at the top of the hype cycle as well. And both of those technologies have transformed industries. And we've seen that in spades during the pandemic. Other innovations, however, like 3D printing, which you see here. Whoop, let me go back. 3D printing and augmented reality, they're still potentially transformational, but still a work in progress. And I think the key point that we want to make to everyone listening today is that you do need to prepare your organizations to pivot to the future as it unfolds. So when we were doing our review of the research, we were looking at for examples of ROI, and it's just really tough because most blockchain projects are currently private. It's very difficult to get ROI information, and quite honestly, most of the companies that we talked to were very early on in the projects. Some were stuck in, actually not some, many were stuck in pilot purgatory, and it was really tough to see the ROI. But we did see it, and we'll talk about where we saw it in just a moment. But what I wanted to point to is a study that the IBM Institute for Business Value completed. And they looked at the different roles that companies take in blockchain. So they define, three different categories: joiners, who they seek efficiency, and they're basically joining existing blockchains. So, for example, Walmart has a blockchain for leafy greens. If I want to supply leafy greens to Walmart, I need to join their blockchain. Builders seek to create blockchains within their industries that provide new services, and expanders are interested in industry or cross-industry networks. So that's more in the future. That's what all of these consortiums that you might have heard about, like in our industry, BITA is a big organization, blockchain for transportation. And dozens of companies are part of that, trying to establish standards. So three different categories. One of the notable takeaways from the study is what their expectations of ROI were. Joiners expected higher returns in 10 years than higher risk builders and expanders, which we actually all of us thought was pretty interesting. And it's kind of it's a safe way to get your feet wet in blockchain versus the more aggressive stance you can take in to be a builder or an expander. I did see a presentation on blockchain yesterday from Bobby Bernard, who is the executive director of data strategy and innovation at Lenovo, and they've made a big investment in blockchain. And what I thought was interesting there was they were actually network builders and network expanders. They're building their own blockchains within the industry, all the way through from sourcing through fulfillment, and at the same time they're participating in consortiums to drive industry standards. But at the end of the day, this isn't real ROI. This is just what they expect. So what are real companies saying? So we went out and we talked to real companies and got their feedback. And these are some of the companies that we talked to on the screen right now. So what are the big things that they said to us? You know, kind of the low-hanging fruit, and we heard this from a lot of people, is just getting out of the data collection and manipulation business. When they put their information on the blockchain, they were getting out of the swivel chair integration where they were taking data out of one system and turning around and typing it into to another system. Reducing the negotiation time and the reconciliation of invoices. That's what our case study is about. And if I had to pick one application that's seeing really good ROI right now, it's invoice reconciliation. And I'll tell you why in just the next slide. Reducing liability was something that came up. You know, one of the quotes we had was, if you marry the physical shipment with the data, you can mitigate risk and set up a secure supply chain. You know, one company talked about IBM Food Trust, which is an industry-specific supply chain where, you know, and tracking provenance of goods, and they look at it as an insurance policy. Regulatory compliance, reducing the cost of regulatory compliance was another benefit that came up. In the pharma industry, it was noted from one of the participants that it can take over 200 days to determine what inventory can be destroyed, costing around $80 million a year. So understanding the provenance of pharmaceuticals is extremely important. And that's a great application of blockchain. And then we also heard from companies about new revenue and profit opportunities. And this was typically also tied to provenance. You know, whether, you know, we're talking about, you know, customers that care about, you know, the source, whether their tuna is fair trade tuna, or whether their coffee or other produce was ethically farmed and harvested. A growing segment of the population, and we found this was actually more prevalent in Europe, but becoming more prevalent in the US, is actually a revenue driver if you can prove provenance and the sustainability of the practices in which the goods were created. Probably the most transformative benefit that we heard from customers was around commercial trust. So you think about all of the organizations, processes, and people that are put in place to verify transactions. You know, whether it's a bank, an accountant, you know, think about it in real estate, you know, those transactions. If you're able to create commercial trust digitally, you can reduce the organizational friction and cost of manual verification of transactions. And so I'm going to talk to you about that in terms of the reconciliation of invoices, but think about it, across your organization. And it's really these areas that that are very intriguing. The blockchain, if applied to the shared ownership of data, you get a single source of the truth. It's immutable, as we talked about before, and data being distributed across the secure network. Now, there are other technologies that distribute data across a secured network. Randy, when he takes you through what we call our blockchain screener, will help you determine whether blockchain or another technology might be right for you. But instead of talking about these hypotheticals and what could happen or should happen with blockchain, let me give you a real example. And this was of all the companies we talked to, the one that I thought was the furthest along and probably the best example to share with all of you today is Walmart Canada and what they did with invoice reconciliation with a company called DLT Labs. And I just did a podcast with the CEO of DLT Labs last week. His name is Loudon Owen, brilliant guy. And they worked with Walmart on this solution. And it's, you want to apply blockchain to an area that's causing you real pain. And invoice reconciliation causes a lot of pain for a lot of companies. It's estimated that 70% of freight contracts are in some way subject to dispute, tying up some $140 billion and driving administrative expense to a whopping 20% of transportation costs. So Walmart Canada was feeling that pain too. They work with around 70 outside carriers who move millions of pounds of freight annually. When you look at these invoices, as noted on this slide, there are over 200 data points for each invoice and one invoice for each load, which is a huge challenge. There's 7 million different invoice permutations, right? Can be an administrative nightmare. For Walmart Canada, 70% of invoices were in dispute. There were errors. It could be errors, omissions. No one trusted which information was correct or accurate. Some of the information was out of date. And not only does that cost a lot of money in terms of administration, but it causes friction between members of the supply chain that you need to get along with. So they implemented the blockchain. They created these smart contracts that take into account all of the contractual information, all of the information from Walmart and from the carriers is included in the blockchain. It's transparent. Everyone has access to it. And then they have IoT devices that track the movement of the freight along the way and automatically update the blockchain. And as a result, they're able to deal with any discrepancies or issues along the way before they occur, and are able to pay their vendors very quickly. Essentially, what they did is they broke this contracted event into smaller agreements. So each agreed to in real time according to the business logic dictated in the smart contract. And again, they were able to head off disputes. Moreover, they it offered a chance to establish an immutable chain of data and share it with partners to achieve full transparency. So sounds like a lot of work, but they actually implemented it fairly quickly. I believe the platform solution that DLT Labs has is it gets them about 80% the way there. Then there's a customization that is done. Then they ran a pilot with one carrier to prove it. And then once they proved it with that one carrier, they rolled it out fairly quickly to the other 69 carriers. So what? So what did they achieve? A 97% decrease in disputes and carriers getting paid faster. According to Supply Chain Brain did a focus on this particular case study earlier this month, and talked about Walmart Canada realizing an immediate savings of $30 million as carrier contracts went into production according to plan. So it was, like I said, it was hard to find, where's the real ROI, because so many companies were in the pilot phase or stuck in the pilot phase. But this is one where they applied blockchain, and when I tried to press, was there any other technology that could have done this same solution? DLT Labs came back and would say, no, this application had to be blockchain. The other thing that I will share with you, which is a key success factor, which I think is really, really important, and that is when DLT Labs got into this pilot with Walmart Canada, they did the pilot with the expectation that they were going to commercialize the solution if it was a success. And it's a really important point, because if you're just testing it, if you're just dipping your toe in the water, you might have your IT folks involved in the pilot, but you probably won't have a lot of involvement from the business. That turns out to be a mistake more often than not. It's really important that you get the business people that will actually be using the solution involved. And it's really hard to do that unless there is an intent to commercialize. Okay, so last slide on the research. There were some limitations. So as we talked about, we saw a lot more companies getting stuck in pilots than we did the Walmart Canada example. And there's a lot of issues here. At the center of this, what I call the elephant in the room, is the lack of standards and interoperability. If I join Walmart's blockchain for leafy greens, as we talked about, what about Kroger's blockchain or Publix or someone else's? You have to, it's a whole different effort. And so there's not a lot of interoperability between blockchains right now. And that's what the standard setting organizations are for. And then, there's still distrust. So one of the quotes that I listed here is, in Europe, if Carrefour joins a blockchain, other retailers that compete with Carrefour may not join that blockchain. There's an issue around insufficient incentives, and that's one of the big kind of golden rules that we heard over and over and over again from companies, is that every member of your blockchain has to have a value proposition. And if they don't, your blockchain effort is in trouble. Another one that I will point out that hadn't really thought about before, but one of the things about liability is that there's a transparency of information. So, FedEx and UPS, for example, were kind of ran afoul with the government for their role in transporting prescription drugs several years ago. And the argument that they made was that they don't know what's in the package. If all of that was on the blockchain, they would know. And so that increased transparency would actually increase their potential liability. And I think the last point that I'll make here before turning over to Randy is around change management. And this was another big thing that we heard, that implementing blockchain is not a technology problem. The problem is social coordination and getting everyone to agree to use one system, blockchain or otherwise, is always the hardest thing. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Randy and get to, what's the pragmatic go forward advice that we have for all of you today.
Thanks, Alan. So guys, one of the things we wanted to touch on is, as Alan was alluding to at the end, a lot of decision-making frameworks that we have seen tend to focus primarily on the architectural structure of a blockchain, whether it be public, private, hybrid, or consortium-based model. And there are a series of questions that an organization should go through, and it's fortuitous that we refer to these as screeners, because these are not the be-all, end-all, but they are necessary starting points. And then there are other frameworks out there that take some of these starting points and begin to delve into them at a little more granular level. And so part of this is trying to really understand, when you think about the problem or pain point in your organization, does anyone care about it? And if they do care about it, then that's further suggests that we should be willing and in a position to continue this conversation about trying to consider whether or not blockchain might be a viable solution to help us resolve or to mitigate the issues pertaining to that problem. The other piece is when it comes to data sharing. And here we just ask a very straightforward question is, do you need to share data with multiple parties? And for many organizations, that answer is easily yes. But I think where the rubber meets the road is when you begin to ask yourselves, are those parties interested in very distinct types and elements when it pertains to that data? And then if so, are those parties that you're sharing with, are they distinct? Is it a multiple number of the same type of organizations? Or do you find that they are different types of organizations after different things? Because that's rapidly going to increase the scope of a blockchain initiative. And then when you get to the next part of this about the ability to access and audit the data, do they need to be able to do this? In other words, do they need read access only, or do they really need read and write access? And then do we really need some form of audit trail or audit log with respect to what happens at every point in time as it pertains to a transaction? And then as you get a little bit down the list here, you begin to see the other part of this is can blockchain, and I love this part here, can it efficiently solve it? It can solve just about a number of issues that we have, but there are so many other solutions that are readily tested and available today that are easily to deploy that probably solve that problem more efficiently. And so the thing here isn't just should we go use blockchain for the sake of using blockchain, but is it a wise use of resources for the issue that we're really trying to address? And you often hear this, the whole aspect of there is no need to really trust the parties in which you're doing business with. And then that brings up this question is that important to you? Can you do business whether or not you need to trust or whether you don't need to trust? And we'll get to that in a little more detail and talk about the economic mechanism associated with respect to that. And as we delve down, when it comes to the business logic, is the business logic sound? And most importantly, is the business logic simple? And if it is, you're probably in a position where you can start to consider how do you approach a blockchain initiative around that. If the business logic is not well understood, if it's a bit unstable, then you're probably a bit premature to be really talking about blockchain. Alan, if you would take us to the next slide, please. And so in this particular next slide here, what we're going to delve into is we're going to get into sort of the building blocks And what we did is we said, let's take the decision aids that are out there and let's look at those, but let's answer the question of what are those aids not tapping into? And let's also think about this from the perspective of not someone who's going to be from a technological portion of the organization that might either be responsible of building or interlinking the supply chain, but let's think about it from someone who has to make a funding decision around this, or someone who has to be able to sell this as a strategic initiative that the organization should pursue. And so with respect to that, we came back to 3 domains or dimensions that we refer to that an organization really has to consider. And then we put together about 15 questions that span these 3 dimensions that an organization not only should ask, but hopefully are able to answer. And so if you take the one at the very bottom, which we consider to be foundational here, we call these the capabilities dimension. And the whole point of the capabilities dimension is to focus on the economic impact associated with developing and deploying what we refer to oftentimes as the key value drivers in supply chain. And that's the trust, transparency, visibility, integrity, consistency, and even the traceability, if you will. And that's not only as it pertains to the data, but that's also with respect to the infrastructure that is actually going to be needed to support a blockchain initiative, whether it's one that you build or whether it's one that you join or whether it's one that you begin to connect. The other dimension here we refer to as incremental improvement. And the reason why this is important is we try to highlight the need that you need to focus on the right now problem, not the problem that's 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, because it is good to have sort of a future vision with respect to this, but you need a payoff now. And one of those aspects we look at is what we refer to as the labor efficiency piece. And I'll delve into that because that's one that's often overlooked. But when we begin to make sense of it, you begin to see it. Alan talked about when you take people who take data from one system, they manipulated it and they put it into another system. That's not only an error-prone process, but there is a highly intensive labor component, which means there are costs associated with doing activities that are not necessarily value added. And so we really have to begin to think about the processes that are archaic and really need to be redesigned so that we can then take advantage of these, because some improvement can be achieved simply by better designing the processes, whereas there are others that even once you've redesigned the process, there's still some opportunities there, and perhaps that's where blockchain comes in. And then we talk about sort of a holistic solution portfolio approach, and we'll delve into that a bit longer in terms of blockchain should not and is not the be-all end-all. It is one component of a multi-pronged solution. And then that brings us to our third building block. And this block here is the one that oftentimes organizations want to talk about, but is not one you can easily jump to. And it's really about, have you thought about the way you can reimagine your business, the way you go to market, how you look in market, how you can improve the value proposition for both your personnel as well as the experience of your customers and your consumers. And so when you take those 3 dimensions, what I'd like to do is delve into a few of the questions that we try to have organizations answer along those lines. So let's take, starting with the capabilities dimension, if you will. One question that we often say that executives really need to consider is, what are the financial implications that are associated with or that have manifested as a result of you having to operate in an environment that's predicated upon trust? And so when you talk about this, we always say, well, it's worth have been able to operate where I don't have to trust the people I'm doing business with. And we say, well, how do you define work? Is there an economic mechanism? Can you quantify the worthiness of being able to operate in an environment where you don't have to trust? Because oftentimes it's easy for us to pay lip service to that, but we've got to get to a point where we can quantify. And the question that often comes to us is, what's the ROI? And we like to turn the table on that and say, you know what, the ROI really is going to be predicated upon what your initial costs are without even pursuing this. Then we can look at the cost benefit associated relative to that. But the problem is we want to know the return when we don't fully understand the investment of not having the solution available to us. So when you talk about the level of distrust and with whom you have the distrust, what level of distrust is acceptable? What level of distrust we have just written off as saying it's the cost of doing business, versus that level of distrust that says, you know what, we can't do business in this environment. Trust is fundamental to business, but only trust between certain parties and only trust to a certain degree. So how much trust is enough trust? And where you don't have enough trust, what's the cost associated with it? Where do you lose when you don't have it? And what do you gain when you do have it? Because that's how you begin to quantify the benefits of blockchain. Another aspect here is we say there needs to be a clear and compelling reason for operating in this ecosystem that doesn't require trust. So there is such a thing as trust evaporation. But at what point along your supply network does that trust evaporate? And when you figure out where that happens, is that problematic? And you may find in some areas of the network it's problematic, but in other areas of the network it's not problematic. And so what it gets into is, what is the relationship management cost associated or that manifests when trust starts to attenuate in various elements, in various areas of the supply network? And that's when you're able to now say, can blockchain address either that attenuation by slowing it, causing it to wane, or can it make it more resilient such that we don't necessarily have that level of evaporation in areas where we can't afford to have it? And now you're able to get to the benefits and the savings. Sometimes it's cost savings, sometimes it's cost avoidance. And then we get into sort of the economic value of full transparency between trading partners. We all want it, but what is it worth? What do you gain from having full transparency? And maybe you realize full transparency isn't what we necessarily need. Maybe full transparency isn't necessarily pragmatic. And so then we go to that second dimension, that incremental improvement dimension. And I'll hit a couple of these questions here. And we talk about that right now problem. It's always great to be forward thinking and think about a blue sky opportunity. But here's the thing, your stakeholders want return now, which means you need to have a problem that you haven't been able to resolve. You need to have an issue that matters to more than just you. It needs to matter to multiple stakeholders. And then you have to be able to truly demonstrate and articulate where, how, and when, by bringing blockchain into this mix, it's going to be that piece we've been missing. It is not the solution we didn't have. It's the synergistic effects that it brings about relative to the other solution that we're utilizing. And that labor efficiency piece that we touched on earlier, think about this. And one of these questions came up about, do we run into some antitrust concerns or regulatory hurdles? Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we ask is, do you operate in an environment where you have to have rules that are governing the transactions or governing the way you do business? And with respect to those rules, they frequently change. And to the point that they frequently change, it creates this unnecessary burden on your staff to either monitor those changes or to be able to build solutions around those changes or to codify the fact that there are consistent changes. Well, that's the piece that, although it's valuable, it's not value added. It's not value added time on the part of those personnel. And so a blockchain can come into play where we can help us to track those changing regulations, changing requirements, to understand when they change, and then when we can initiate one mechanism or course of doing business as a result of that. That's where we begin to see the economic improvement around those things that have really plagued our organizations. And then the other part here is the problem and opportunity you're talking about. Have you accounted for the additional value that blockchain brings? And what I'm saying by that is, you may have a piecemeal solution now, and you believe by bringing blockchain in, it's going to incrementally improve your approach to addressing that. Well, how much does it account for addressing that? Is it a 10% improvement in terms of your ability to address that problem? Or is it a 25% improvement with respect to your ability to address that particular issue? Because your ROI is tied into understanding the incremental improvement in terms of problem resolution, as well as value realization. And that leads us to this third block here, which we refer to as this reimagination piece. When you think about this, are you considering how and where and when you can deploy something that is transformative from a business model standpoint? Or are you looking at it from the point of that we can just make our existing processes more efficient? Improving process efficiency is valuable, but when you're talking about a transformative solution, it's not worth the investment if all you're going to get is operational improvement. Improvement has to be a bit more strategic and less tactical, and definitely less operational. And the other part here is when we think about the product and services that we can put into the marketplace, what are those products and services, and what is the market potential associated with those that blockchain enables us to do? And then the customer experience. When you can augment the way a customer consumes a product, the way a customer interacts with a product or service, all because you've been able to liberate that additional information that is of value to them. That in and of itself is worthy of considering investing in blockchain. And then last but not least, the employee value proposition. We know now that at least for the past 5 years, one of the top 2 challenges among supply chain organizations is hiring and retaining qualified talent or the appropriate talent. One of the other things that we do know is the top talent and the best talent goes to organizations that are innovatively and digitally oriented. Doesn't mean that you've cracked the nut around that, but what it means is that you're willing to go out on a limb, you're willing to pursue these avenues that may not be fully vetted. And when you do this, you're able to attract the talent that you previously weren't able to attract because they want to be linked to organizations that are innovative, forward-thinking, and are willing to push the envelope. And so when we think about these, what are the best practices that we found along the way by way of these executives in the companies that we've talked with over this time? Number one, you've got to make sure that you not only involve business leaders, but that they're actually leading the charge. This is not something that you leave purely to your supply chain function, and it's definitely not something you leave purely to your IT function. This needs to be a business initiative, not a technology project. And when you go down the route of piloting, it needs to be purposeful, intentional, and directional such that the goal of piloting isn't to see if it works. The goal of piloting is to figure out how best to scale. And that's very similar to the example that Alan gave you with respect to Walmart. It wasn't just does it work, it's how do we make it scale such that we can get greater value. The other thing here, be agnostic. Don't be so locked into one version, one variant of blockchain, because the reality is this: as we look at the future of this, there are going to be multiple iterations of blockchains and multiple variants that are going to be out there on different technological platforms, and they're going to have to integrate. And so it's not just one, it's really a network of networks is where this is going to be going. So at some point, you're going to be playing there. And don't believe that the fear of missing out is a viable strategy. A reactive strategy in this case is a losing proposition. And you're going to be sorely disappointed in terms of the sunk costs that go into it, because you have to have direction here. And then last but not least, let's be smart. Alan has already illustrated how smart contracts are the low-hanging fruit. There are so many elements and use cases in organizations that can take great advantage of them. And really, it does not require Herculean effort to deploy those to get you monumental improvements. And then last but not least, build the coalitions that you believe are going to help catapult you into where you need to be organizationally. And so with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Alan, and then we'll be really ready to take any additional questions you might have. Thank you guys very much.
All right. Hey, Randy, that was great. Thank you. And I hope that you got that front end with what we heard from the market, what we heard from the customers. We gave you an example, and then kind of laid out what we really wanted to do for our members is to lay out, okay, so based on all this information, what should I do? How should I be looking this? Give me a framework. And that's what we tried to do. And hopefully we were successful. And so we have, I think, about 10 minutes left in this session, and we'd love to take any questions that you have.
And I think that Randy and Alan were wanting to pose a question to our companies here as well, that how applicable is the blockchain screener to your business? And so if anybody would like to chime in, I'm sure they would love to discuss that applicability with you all as well.
The Zoom fatigue is set in.
It seems that way.
Either that or we have a very, very shy group. But either way, Alan, one thing I will add here to something that you mentioned earlier, and we saw this with respect to the interviews. So many organizations, both small, medium, and large, are really just trying to struggle with, they feel like they need to do something around this, or at least have it on the agenda, because they're getting bombarded, either whether it's those questions are coming from the board or whether those questions are coming from trading partners, because we're bombarded with it in the trade magazines. And the reality is you don't really need to be forced into this. This is not something where you say it's the solution and you go find the problem. We're not here to sell anything. Our goal here was to help augment your ability to make clean, logical decisions around where, when, and where blockchain makes sense for your organization. And if it doesn't make sense, at least now you can definitively say why it doesn't make sense now, but what would need to change either from an organizational perspective or what would need to change in the marketplace for it to make sense for you. And when you're able to stand firm and do that, we think you're light years ahead of so many other organizations that are still grappling with these basic questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Alan, there's a question here from Charles Jones, and it's, how would you see blockchain applied to the railroad and ocean shipping industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Maersk does with Maersk with IBM has a visibility solution that they've applied to the ocean shipping industry. The same general solution would also be applicable to railroad. But the idea here is, in the ocean shipping industry, you have a lot of different supply chain participants, right? You have the ocean liners, you have all of the NVOCCs, and then you have all of their customers, and then these are all international shipments typically, right? So you have all of the customs information that's in the supply chain. And so it's really a great application of blockchain because it's not a tight controlled blockchain or a tight controlled network where there's few participants, and have trust in all of them. In these supply chains, they're very distributed with a lot of different members who you may or may not know, but yet you have to transact with. And so what happens when you don't know someone and you have to transact with them? You typically need some kind of intermediary to confirm transactions, which is what happens today. And that's what causes a lot of friction and cost in the supply chain. And so the idea is that blockchain, because it isn't immutable, because it can be used for this idea of commercial trust, if you have all of these transactions in this shared ledger, everyone in this supply chain, whether it's the railroad or ocean supply chain, has access to that information, full transparency. You have a higher level of trust, and you can lower that transaction cost, that friction of conducting business with a lot of supply chain participants that you don't know and haven't necessarily established trust.
Alan, one other area that I think about, particularly if you're thinking about sort of the ocean liners or the shipping industry, maritime sector, is when you think about it, if you're a port and you've got all of these containers coming in, the steamship liners, so you know who's bringing it and you know what they're bringing in terms of the cargo, but you don't necessarily know whose products are inside the cargo all the time. And so that manifest data, there's a challenge to be able to provide the manifest data to a port so that they could then go out and drum up secondary business with respect to the customers whose products are moving through the ports, because many steamship liners aren't willing to share that because they see some of that as being proprietary. Yeah. But that's where blockchain makes sense, because you can pick and choose which elements of the manifest data actually hits the chain. And so the data that's private, you can keep private, but the data that the ports could benefit from, that can help create even more business for the steamship liners, that's a value add where blockchain could very well be beneficial.
Yeah, great point.
Well, Hannah, we're down to our last 5 minutes and we don't see any new questions coming in. So we're going to toss it back over to you for the outro.
All right. Randy, Alan, thank you so much for being here and for presenting on this. I had the privilege of hearing them present on blockchain as it related to our Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative this past summer. And so it's been really interesting to hear the developments and just the new takes that you all always have on it. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all of our Supply Chain Forum partners who joined us today and for all of our sessions. We have wrapped up week 5 of 5. This has been a wild fall. Thank you all so much for, going with the flow and working with us on our new virtual forum format. Randy was one of our pioneers of the virtual format when he facilitated our healthcare panel in the spring of 2020. And I think we've come a long way since then. We're very excited to take our learnings from these past 5 weeks and apply them to our April 2021 forum. And if you have any feedback for us, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email me at gsci@utk.edu. All of our recordings for the sessions are uploaded by the end of the week following the session. So for instance, this recording will be up by next Friday. And so if you all haven't had the opportunity to catch any of our previous sessions, we had 4 wonderful mega sessions and several really interesting breakout sessions from our great faculty, our students, lots of different groups, then you can always go back and check those out. We also have the presentation decks and a few of written summaries of our sessions. So all of that can be found in our GSCI app. If you have any questions, we are here for you. We're excited to announce our dates and content for the April forum. That information will be coming soon. And in the meantime, everybody have wonderful holiday season. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.